The story of Naboth and the greedy king is probably historically accurate. There's no reason to doubt it. The details are given, and it's painful to hear. Stoning is a terrible death, all because of a sin of greed. We might be tempted to look at it and say, how horrid, but not to see actually the beam in our own eye. When we were burying Mam, a couple of years ago now, 2.5, Ellen and 3 of you, Teresa and Anne, were together, and we went down not only to the chapel but also to the heart of Wales, next to our family farm, where she was going to be buried next to Dad and the rest of the family. And I did notice that they noticed one big difference between North Wales and Ireland. In fact, Ellen commented, the houses are still what they were. Anywhere in Ireland, one goes from field to field and one finds a new house in between. As big as possible, bigger than the one before it. It has to be a mansion. Well, in Wales, friends of mine who married are still in the same terraced house right now, years later, and quite content, because a house is not made of bricks only, and only becomes a home when there are other ingredients. It doesn't matter, really, all that much, how many cubic centimeters it has, but it matters an awful lot how much warmth is inside. In fact, one day, a couple of years ago, we were quite amused when we went here nearby to see a friend of ours who had a mansion, and it was huge, huger than huge, but very cold because it was too big to heat. And so we thought, warmth. So, this is pretty contemporary. And what happens? For social status, people will carry the albatross of a mortgage until death. Whereas my friends in their terraced house, even though they might have got to being headmaster, they're still happy in the terraced house. And no mortgage. And freedom. Less room to have to heat, a smaller garden, but warmth, a simple life. And life being short and unique, which is the richer? What are riches? And what is social status? Especially if in the mansion, somewhere along the line, the marriage has collapsed. There are other ingredients. So this is pretty contemporary. As is the gospel. Did you notice that it's the gospel in the evangelical sense of the paradox, which is going far further than the Old Testament, of which the Sermon on the Mount is essentially a prolonged commentary. You have heard that it was said, and I tell you, bringing out the meaning, the deeper meaning. And that, by the way, is why it's only with the gospel that we have the correct understanding of holy matrimony. Because we're moving, remember, from already the stop to polygamy, in the Ten Commandments, to eventually the gospel sacramental nature, which is linked precisely with the nature of the human being, which the Lord pulls out in very strong terms. The old translation is cleave unto his wife and becoming one flesh, and that's why the Lord points out that the project of the Maker is such that when he's involved, that is not just in nature and in sin, but in a real bonding authorized by heaven, it's not so simple, because there is a third person in the equation. Therefore, it's important to understand what's going on here. I just make this parenthesis before I go on to my main point, but it's a problem also with the East, and you know why. Cardinal Müller, when he was head of the CDF, pointed out this problem actually to the East, that it's a sacramental problem in theology, because what happened in the East was this. All along the history of the Eastern Bloc, there was a very close association with the empire, and even actually in Russia it carried on in a different form. You know that the fall of Constantinople was much later than that of Rome. It was 1453, and therefore all those centuries Big Brother was looking. It was actually the emperor still having a huge hold, and therefore they had sometimes to conform and yield to pressure. So that would explain how they had this principle of economia, in which a second union, one second union, is allowed before a priest in church if a marriage collapses irremediably. But theologians would look into the sacramental bonding there, and they would tend to say, actually it's not sacramental because of the Lord's words, but it is a concession of economia to limit the damage of the human state, lest they go into complete nature and savageness. But it's sacramentally a problem. And that's why right now there's a lot of discussion, a lot of ink flowing about what is going on in sacramental theology, precisely in marriage. Why? The church is not above its master. And the Court of Appeal is not any human being or Court of Appeal with regard to schools of thought here and there. It's Jesus, the Logos, the Alpha and the Omega, whose words the church must listen to, and is not enabled in any way in his name to reinterpret against the wish of the Maker. So let's get this straight. It's in our interest always to be aware that all we can do is listen. We can't create a new teaching which is not in the Gospel. It can't be done. I close that parenthesis. The reading in the Gospel today talks about not resisting, turning the cheek, giving, and going the extra mile. So here we have that heroic element coming in, which far surpasses the Old Testament, and gives us what is eventually going to be crystallized when the Lord gives his last will and testimony in the New Commandment, simplifying enormously things. Well, this has been picked up and lived out by the Christian centuries. There are many, many glorious examples of this happening. One which would be worth bearing in mind would be that of a great Irishman who became important in Rome but did much work in secret. It's Monsignor Hugh O'Flaherty. He had access to all kinds of circles and used those contacts to rescue a huge, and I mean a huge number of Jews in very clever ways. And when it became clear that the Nazi officer with whom he had to do was a very dangerous man, he was very brave. We have a film which is historically accurate about the event. It's called The Scarlet and the Black. And in it we have very clearly this element of heroic Christian charity coming through. It seemed that what happened was this. Shortly before the liberation of Rome, which was the 25th of April 1945, since then a national feast day in Italy, the Nazi officer in question, the head of all the operations in occupied Rome, could see probably what was going to happen by then, and that therefore he would be eliminated, but also his family. He got one of his collaborators to seek out Monsignor O'Flaherty in secret and to try to get him to meet none less than the officer himself, the head of all the Nazi operations, in secret. Now, he could have refused. It could have obviously been taken as a ploy to get him. But he dared to go and met him. And the request made by the officer was that he would eventually give some kind of safe conduct out of Rome to his family, his wife and children, so at least they could be spared. And there's a very moving scene in which he thinks, of course, that the Monsignor has turned his back on him and cries out, "Priest! Priest!" and goes off with himself. But the film finishes with eventually a jump in time when the Nazi head of operations is in prison and somebody goes to ask him, "Who got your wife and family out into safety?" And he answers, "I do not know. I do not know." And he was told who had. The result was that he went into some kind of softening of heart, encountered God in prison, and became a Catholic. With regard to this going the extra mile and doing anything to rescue one's soul, it's something that we also find through the Christian centuries, and we still find it actually more than we think. The priest who here and there will do anything rather than lose a soul. Another film that is worth looking at is Dead Man Walking. It's about death row, and a lapsed Catholic is in there and going to be executed. A sister, Sister Helen Pouget, will not let him lose his soul. She gets permission from the chaplain to go in and make his acquaintance. He warns her, but she goes and perseveres and gets to know him. She's young enough still to be interesting to a man in prison, and she does what a great saint has done before her, which I will quote at the end. She knows that perhaps the best she can do is avoid that he die in a state of hatred, vengeance, unforgiveness, and the cancer of bitterness. At least if he can have warmth and love, perhaps that will be enough just to save his soul by turning it also into prayer at the last second. And so she allows him to be bonded with her and tries by that means somehow to soften him, and it seems that something does pass, but it's a mystery as to what actually happens at the last moment. We have a case which is a classic by now, but in which it's very clear that it did pass, and it's our own local saint where we were in Italy. I'll quote some of her letter to her spiritual father, Blessed Raymond of Capua, who eventually was head of the Dominican order. This is what happened. There was a criminal, but criminal in those days wasn't quite the same as what it was for us. The crime in this case was speaking out against the Republic. Siena was its own thing. His name was Niccolò di Toldo, from Perugia. He was condemned to death and was in prison in Siena. She writes to Blessed Raymond, the confessor. I went to visit the man you know. He received such strength and consolation from my visit. Remember now, she is only in her 20s, at the most early 30s. She dies at 33. He had never been to confession or communion. He works, or she works upon him to allow him to bond with her, the only person really who cared. And this is the upshot. He went to confession and prepared himself well. He asked me to promise, for the love of God, that I would be with him when the time of execution came. I promised, and I kept my word. So, that morning, before the bell rang, I went to him, and I was greatly consoled. I took him to Mass, and he received Holy Communion, which he had never done before. His will was conformed and open to God's will. He had just one fear, namely, that he might not be strong enough when the moment came. God, in his overwhelming and burning goodness, deceived him, however, by giving him such love and affection for me in God, that he did not know how to be without him. He kept saying, "Stay with me and don't leave me. Then I shall be fine, and I shall die content." He leaned his head on my breast, and I sensed both tremendous joy and the fragrance of his blood, not separate from the fragrance of my own blood, which I hope to shed for gentle Jesus, my bridegroom. As my own desires increased, and I felt his fear, I said, "Courage, my dear brother. We shall soon be at the wedding feast. You will go there bathed in the sweet blood of God's Son, and in the sweet name of Jesus. Never forget this. I shall be waiting for you at the place of execution." So, he makes this declaration, "I shall go joyfully and courageously, and it will seem like 1,000 years until I get there, thinking that you will be there waiting for me." I waited for him at the place of execution, and as I waited, I kept praying in the presence of Mary and Catherine, Virgin and Martyr. Before he arrived, I lay down and stretched my neck on the block and begged Mary for the grace I wanted, namely, that I might give him light and peace of heart at the moment of death, and then see him reach his goal. I was so overcome by the gentle assurance I received about this, that although a great crowd was there, I saw no one. Then he arrived, like a meek lamb. And when he saw me, he began to smile. He asked me to make the sign of the cross over him. So I blessed him and said, "Down to the wedding feast, my gentle brother. You will soon be in everlasting life." He prostrated with great meekness, and I stretched out his neck and bent down to him, reminding him of the blood of the Lamb. His lips kept murmuring only, "Jesus" and "Catherine." And he was still murmuring when I received his head into my hands, while my eyes were locked on the divine goodness, as I said, I will. Then I saw the God-man as one sees the radiance of the sun. He stood ready to receive the man's blood into his own, and the fire of holy desire which was poured into and concealed in that soul by grace was now received into the fire of his own divine charity. When he was at rest, my soul rested in peace and quiet, so aware of the fragrance of blood that I could not remove the blood which had splashed onto me. Alas, wretch that I am, I can say no more. With great envy, I saw myself left behind. One thing we all have which we can use to save a soul: our humanity. The Lord did not leave a book of rubrics before dying on the cross. He left a new commandment. Let's